Hi, everyone. This is Joseph Rosales, and welcome to Business in the New Normal, where we try and share valuable, balanced information with our listeners to help you not just survive, but thrive in these very challenging times that we find ourselves navigating through. This is my co-host, Ike Devji. How are you this morning, Ike?
Good to be with you both.
Good. And we have a guest who I'm going to introduce in just a moment, David Moore, and we'll talk more about David in a sec.
Start to become an even more effective leader immediately. Get your copy of the Leader Review at theleaderreview.com.
But Ike, what's going on, man? Crazy times, and we have a new president coming tomorrow. We have a new administration. We have a new vaccine. We have a lot of new things coming our way. And we're going to dedicate this episode to the vaccine and some of the things around the vaccine. But what's going on in your world? How you been?
Good. Thank you. Busy. Busy with all of the things that you mentioned. Folks have questions on some of those issues. They're doing planning that anticipates the inauguration tomorrow. They're doing planning for security issues around the inauguration that we've all been advised about and talked about, where there have been rumors of protests and things planned in different parts of the country. So folks who are geographically located in cities where that may be an issue if there's a protest are asking some questions about that. And then we have, the things that are more closely related to the core of at least what I do as an attorney, with folks implementing structures and looking at how to preserve their wealth and how to get ready for this recovery, which we all anticipate will follow the country reaching a good level of the vaccine.
Yeah, really interesting. And for those listeners who don't know, Ike is a asset protection attorney based here in Scottsdale, in Arizona, and has clients all over the country who he helps them protect and grow their wealth and their assets. And it's really interesting because on my end of it, we're staying very closely informed on all things related to the pandemic and the economy, because as one of the hosts here of Business in the New Normal, we need to be informed, and we encourage our listeners to be informed, to listen to all the sides. You have some people that just listen to one news channel, and you have listened to the other news channel, and you get very diverse opinions about what's going on in our country and what's going on in our communities and what's going on in people's lives. And we try and help people understand both sides and the middle, because that's where you're going to be most informed. That's where you're going to be able to make the best decisions for you, your family, your business. And, as a leadership and performance development coach, what I see is people struggling to make decisions. What do I do? And some of the decisions that we're going to even talk about today, they can't be driven by emotion. They have to be driven by facts. And that's one of the most challenging things in my life. I'm 65 years old. I've never seen this much uncertainty, this much division, this much what do you do, how do you do it, when do you do it, and we're begging for some clarity, which is what I think we're trying to do with this program. We started this program back in June. And every week we're talking about the issues. So we see that, and so today our guest David Moore is going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are coming for employers relative to the vaccine, and he's also going to talk a little bit about some of the things that might be coming for employees relative to the vaccine. And I know, Ike, you can talk about that as well, because there are rights and there are obligations on both sides of this equation. And there are two sides of the equation. You're an employer, you're an employee, one or the other. And you might be a solopreneur, and you're out there going to start really ramping up your business if you can, and making contact with people. And, you may not be able to travel if you don't have a vaccine passport. So there's a lot of interesting things coming. So speaking of our guest, David, welcome back to the show, my friend. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you very much for having me aboard again, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be part of the podcast. I love the message that you're sending, so the privilege is mine. When we last spoke, I think it was fall of 2020, if I'm not mistaken, maybe late summer. But at that time, we focused on COVID and a couple of policies in particular, insurance policies in particular. We talked about D&O, directors and officers, and employment practices liability. And at that time specifically, we discussed how employers had to be very careful if they laid off staff. They had to be consistent when offering or not offering remote work. They had to be diligent when reopening their businesses and topics like that. And in short, they had to be very careful. Employers had to be very careful not to discriminate, had to be aware that the management decisions that they might make could fall under a microscope. And what's interesting to me is today, when we discuss the vaccine and the role that it plays in the workplace, the same adjectives apply: careful, diligent, consistent. And I'll add another word too: balance. Employers must, and I know we'll talk about this today, but employers must balance the regulatory compliance and respect for the individual rights of employees with the overall needs of the business. And so that can be a real slippery slope to navigate, and it's part of the give and take that we see for employers, employees.
Well, yeah, thank you for sharing that as part of the opening. I know that it was September when you were with us, and seems like it's been a lifetime ago. A lifetime ago, September. That was only 4 months, 4 or 5 months. We're in January now, but we know that you work closely with your clients, not just to help them cover what might be typically required with a business and insurance, but you also look at those things that are not typical, those things that are unique and might be that hidden little issue that somebody doesn't think about. And you and I were talking about this before we started the program today, helping people to become informed and understand that you're not here to sell them insurance. You're here to help them manage and navigate through those requirements that their business has relative to insurance. It's not about making a commission. It's about helping people get the right coverage and make sure that they're covered for those things that nobody, honestly, most people don't want insurance. If they didn't have to have it, they wouldn't have it, because they only need it when they need it, right? But guess what? We all need it. We all have liabilities. We all have things that could come and bite us and take a big chunk out of our assets if we're not covered. So thank you for being here again. I know, Ike, anything you want to share as we open up here?
Yeah, this is an interesting issue. As you know, we're now in phase, at least in Arizona, what we're referring to as phase 1B, right, in the vaccination process, where we have the second tier of folks who are eligible to receive the vaccine coming in. And as it becomes more widely available, employers are certainly going to try and mandate that, as David said, to balance the need to protect the business, its customers, its other employees, and its continuity. And so, yes, this is one of the legal issues that will emerge. I'm sure that there will be litigation about it for people who don't want to be vaccinated. Some of that will fall under the scope of the employment practices liability insurance that we talked about with David on his last visit. Some of it will also center around the two primary exemptions, if you will, to employer mandated vaccination. And those are essentially, there are two big ones that we're looking at from a legal perspective. One is a legitimate religious objection. So merely being an anti-vaxxer is not a legitimate religious objection. And the other one, of course, is a ADA recognized health condition that would make that vaccination impossible.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and David, you as an insurance provider, you've been getting a lot of information in from professionals, from experts about the vaccine and about insurance and things like it. Why don't you talk about it a little bit, because this is coming, and this is a very potentially divisive issue from people. And it's like the mask and no mask. It's vaccine, no vaccine. And there's going to be a lot more pressure on this one than there was even on the mask. But talk to us about what you're hearing about people returning to work and employers, in that whole relationship.
Well, we know that if employers bring back employees earlier in 2021, if they bring them back before the vaccine is available, that they're exposing themselves to a greater degree of liability. We know that to be, to be factual if you can. And so one of the questions that is being asked is, can I require my workforce to be vaccinated? And I just touched on that with the religious belief bullet point, along with the, can it exacerbate a medical condition? And so that's where we kind of tie in a little bit of insurance with a little bit of legal. And from an insurance perspective, we don't know how all these are going to turn out in the courts because some of these cases haven't been tried yet. But what we're doing from an insurance perspective is we're telling people, and I think this is really good advice, is if you have a D&O policy, if you have an employment practices liability policy, well, by all means, keep it, okay? Secondly, we're telling people don't change policies at this point in time because some of these policies, even renewal policies, are having exclusions like layoff or reduction in force exclusions, things we've never seen before. So there's a situation where you need to talk to your agent and say, is the policy that I'm renewing the exact same policy that I had? Are there any fine points, any details that I need to be aware of? So we're telling people, honestly, don't change your policies, but make sure that there aren't exclusions that have been added. I think that's very, very important right there. Here's something else that I find interesting. So let's say that you take your people through the process of getting the vaccine and you ask all the right questions. Maybe you're temperature checking. Maybe you are asking the COVID questions that we've all had to answer at different places. Even the pre-screening questions are important. Okay, so an employer must show that the pre-screening questions are job related, okay, and consistent with business necessity. And it's very important for employers that they don't condition the employment to the vaccinations. So, from an employment practices liability, we think that there's going to be an onslaught of claims that follow along this line. And it's just, I don't know what direction it's going to go, but we're concerned with privacy violations. So maybe I'll give you one last example. So let's say that you're an HR director and you ask these questions and you take a person through this process and then you keep those questions in their HR file or their personnel file. Well, if it gets exposed to somebody, now we have a privacy issue. So again, the employment practices liability, I think, is more important today than it's ever been.
Wow.
David, does the scope of the D&O policies and the EPLI policies, which is the employment law insurance that we've discussed and are talking about now, the policies that you see out there currently, the majority of them, do they adequately address the scope of these risks in their new form? Or do folks need to upgrade to policies that have better, deeper coverage? Obviously, dollar limit coverage is something you and I both see is inadequate for for many business owners.
Right.
Whether we're talking to a medical practice owner or whether we're talking to some other small business owner, what we often see, and I know we've shared this experience, is that if they either don't have the coverage or if they have the coverage, it's often not enough. So can you talk to us about the adequacy of current coverage levels, both in terms of the depth of the coverage and the width of the coverage, meaning how many things it covers?
I really like the old policies better. Let's go back 2 years, okay? Something called a pandemic had never even been contemplated. Okay, so they're not going to
pandemic exclusion.
It's not going to be in there, is it?
Right.
And so these new policies today, when, like I was referring to earlier about the layoff or reduction in force exclusions, those didn't exist a couple years ago. So that's why we're telling people to be really, really careful. I think the breadth of the policies were better. And I think if you would take out a policy today, you might find that some of the language has been fine-tuned, if you will, to favor the insurance company more than the client. So I would be fearful of buying a D&O policy. If I employed a lot of people, I did not have one in place, I would definitely be sure to ask all the right questions before I'd put that policy in place, because the carrier has certainly contemplated those exposures.
And David, that's something that you could help any of our listeners with, helping them navigate through what those questions should be. Yes.
I think so, yes.
Okay. Well, that's important, because it's one thing to know you should be asking questions. It's another to know what those questions are.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting. So let's talk about a little bit more about that. We got a vaccine that isn't mandatory at this point, but it's going to be probably something that a majority of businesses, it's going to start with airlines and move through different segments of business, would be desirable for people to take. And there are going to be people that just don't want to. And whether it's the two reasons that Ike said, a fundamental religious restriction belief, or something that's ADA related, that there's medical reasons why they can't. That's gonna be a mess trying to unravel that, because people can say, I don't want to take it because I don't believe in them. And how do you prove it? I mean, you got a card that says I have a religious. I mean, I don't know how that works. So it's going to be interesting. So what else do employers need to do to prepare for this inevitable question that is going to come up? Do we require our people to vaccinate or not?
You want to take that one, Ike?
Well, I think they're all of the same issues that the rest of the country is dealing with. So number one, can we legally mandate that everyone here, and I'm speaking from the employer's chair for a moment. So number one, can we legally mandate that every employee gets vaccinated? Secondly, what are those two legal objections that we need to be careful of as employers? Third, what liability do we have as employers for mandating that if an employee has an adverse reaction to the vaccine? And do we have any responsibility as to how and when and where that vaccine was administered and which vaccine that person received? Right. So we've got all of these layers of choices and decisions, some of which are going to be handled by third parties, some of which are going to be directly the choice or influence of the employer, right? The employer may pick a certain facility or a certain vendor to provide that vaccination that has picked a particular vaccine. So where does that due diligence responsibility end, right? We know that, for instance, physicians themselves who do in-office drug treatment have a very high level of liability for making sure that the drugs they're dispensing are of a certain quality and purity and from a legitimate source and aren't expired and all of these other details, right? So the same thing, this bundle of legal issues on something that on its surface seems very simple, which is, hey, nobody wants to get sick, everybody's going to get a shot. Well, unfortunately, as the lawyer, I will say, when the damn lawyers get involved, everything gets much more complicated.
Yeah.
And that's just some of the things that I have discovered in my own evaluation of these risks and things that I've written about for medical journals and for my, the information I distribute to my clients, is these are some of the issues that I'm finding, right? Is who is going to be responsible for all of these things at a decision-making level and at a liability level. Does that make sense? The way that I'm laying that out?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And it's interesting because I go back to, the one exemption that would be most often utilized is I don't believe in vaccines, and I don't, and I have a religious exemption or a religious position on it. And as an employer, you better be careful how you ask the question, because in employment, in employment practices, and HR directors know this, you can't ask questions about sex and age and things like family. You can't ask if somebody's married. You definitely cannot ask somebody their religious affiliation. That's discrimination all over the place. So if somebody says I have a religious objection to it, and you delve into that, there's some really scary, murky waters that employers are going to have to be aware of. I'm interested in us as a program figuring out, how do you ask that question?
Well, and I'm also asking, I actually emailed a friend who's on the employment law side of the business.
Okay, cool.
And asked a question, which was, hey, if we are, screening people based on these objections, how do you do that? Do you do it proactively and say, hey, who in this room has a legitimate religious exemption or objection, or an ADA health condition that would exempt them from our vaccination policy and program? Or do you say, hey, everybody's getting vaccinated, it's a condition of employment, and then do you wait for people to object and then run them through some kind of screening process to determine if their religious objection is valid, reasonable, and established, and if they have an ADA recognized health condition that would put them in that exempt category? And as I've said, it's very clear that I'm an anti-vaxxer is not the same as either of those two things, right? And when I say anti-vaxxer, it's probably coming across as a little bit more pejorative than I mean it to sound, meaning that maybe somebody's afraid, maybe they think it's untested, or enough people haven't had it yet, or maybe there is somebody who just thinks that all vaccines are the tool of the devil, right? And somewhere in between those is where objectors are going to fall. So my question to my employment law friend is, hey, when do you ask these questions?
Right.
Is it if they object, or do you have to do it proactively?
Yeah.
I haven't seen anything definitive on that yet. Have you, David?
I have not. No, not yet.
Well, it's coming, because those
And
questions.
we're, in our industry, we're reactionary, aren't we? In many senses. Until we know how some of these things are going to be filtered out through the legal system, it's really hard for us to be proactive. And that's why, and again, I refer back to it, that's why we're seeing some of these exclusions. I see our industry kind of trying to predict the direction that the courts are going to go with some of these decisions. And that's not a perfect world.
Yeah.
David, I'd love to ask you your opinion on coverage limits. As I alluded to earlier, one of the problems we see is that people don't have coverage. The other problem that we see is that people have coverage and they're wearing the emperor's new clothes a little bit, because the coverage they have is simply a rider on a larger policy.
Correct.
At insufficient limit. So I'm a doctor who has 15 employees. I'm a restaurant owner that's got 20 employees. What are good limits on these things? My rule of thumb for my clients for years has been, I want to see $1 million on EPLI. I want to see $1 million on data breach. I want to see $1 million in D&O. And obviously, if the business is a very big operation with very large numbers of employees and huge amounts of revenue, then those numbers should be even higher. But that's just me from the lawyer's desk thinking, how much of a cushion do I want in front of my client? What does it look like from your side of the desk on the insurance side?
Really, really good question. So I'm going to go backwards a little bit with what you talked about with some of these people putting it on their policies as an endorsement. We've got some small employers, and a small employer could be 15 people or less, okay? And they will buy employment practices liability and put it on their policy and think they've adjusted it. And I've literally seen it where they buy 50,000 per occurrence, 100,000 aggregate. And when you dig deeper, when you add it by endorsement, you may have first party coverage, but not third party. Okay. So when you buy employment practices liability as an endorsement, you're not even beginning to cover the exposures that you have, and maybe it's just enough for some defense. Okay, so I don't recommend that at all. I'm with you. I love the $1 million limit. If you can get 1 million, 2 million with, you know, 1 million per occurrence, 2 million aggregate, great. What some clients really struggle with is finding carriers that will sell them more than 1 million on the employment practices liability side. So if they actually go and buy a separate D&O with EPL, the sky's the limit. You can get up to, you know, the 2 million to 5 million to whatever the number the people are comfortable with. But when they just go and try to add it on with their current carrier, a non-D&O employment practices liability specialist, if you will, then generally what they can buy is, it maxes out a lot of times at 1 million. So the best way to answer it is go find a D&O carrier that specializes in that coverage. And it's not it's not always your Travelers of the world. It's not always your Westfields. It's not always your, you know, your regional carriers. It's some companies that maybe people haven't heard of that have really good D&O forms, really good EPL forms. They're the ones that can sell you from 1 to 5 million, perhaps higher if you really need it. That's the direction you need to go. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And, you know, for both of you to put this in, and for our listeners, most importantly, to put this into context, I look at employment law liability as a very serious exposure for every business owner under normal circumstances without these additional pressures. And I'll throw just a couple of facts and figures at you. The average American business owner is 5 times more likely to be sued over an employment law issue than for any other reason. All right. Wow. So it is one of the leading causes. The average sexual harassment verdict in this country, as a specific example, is $500,000 plus. The average cost of legal fees to settle a frivolous lawsuit is $91,000. All right. So to look at some of those things and what it costs, when the lawsuit is bogus, you can still spend $100,000 getting out of that or fighting that. And if there's a real claim with a real controversy, the legal fees alone could bankrupt many small businesses. So I tell my business owners, and I don't sell insurance, so I don't have a dog in that fight, so to speak, but it's part of my duty as an asset protection attorney. And what I tell them is buy this insurance to catch the bullet on the legal fees, if nothing else, because the cost of defense alone can be prohibitive to many of our business owners.
Can I build on that?
Absolutely.
So you're talking with people about asset protection. A lot of times you're talking about the owners, you're talking about the entrepreneurs of the world, and you tell them to talk to me, and we have a conversation, and I collect all the information. And maybe I'm collecting all the information from the HR director. So I may have questions like, hey, I need to know what the revenues are. Need to know the number of employees. Have you ever had a claim? And sometimes the applications can be pretty lengthy, if you will. So we come up with a premium, and let's say the D&O and the employment practices liability is $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a year. I have some HR directors that are making the decision not to buy the coverage because they think it's expensive, and not bringing the owner or the entrepreneur back into the loop. And we kind of touched on this the first time when we were talking about some different coverages as well. I think this is a time for an owner or an entrepreneur, a business person, to spend some time and say, hey, Mr. Insurance Guy, you and I haven't sat down for 3 years. You've done this with my HR director. Hey, Mr. Insurance Guy, we haven't sat down with 5 years. You've done this with my CFO. Let's go to lunch. Or let's get together and let's do a Zoom call, or let's have a meeting. Help me figure out what I have and don't have. I don't think there's a better time to do that than right now.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, you know, that is the dark side of delegation, is being one step removed from the conversation where that vital information is presented.
Right.
And I think that for those who are delegating these decisions, and who can't participate in that conversation with you or somebody like you, that it's important that our listeners ask the question, what are we giving up? How did we come to this amount of coverage? And ask some of the questions behind that decision making, and make sure it's not just based on cost, but based on risk.
Well, you know, it's interesting, and David, thank you for sharing what you just shared, because one of the things that we find in businesses is we get distracted. We're distracted by all this stuff, the vaccine, the consumer confidence, rebuilding our business, all the things that came with this pandemic that nobody thought of, that really have never happened ever before in our lifetimes. So something as simple and fundamental as sitting down with your insurance provider and re-looking at everything is probably not on most people's radar, because it's not top of mind. It's something that I'll do it if I have to. You have to. So again, I'm not in the insurance business, but I'm going to encourage our listeners to just take a look. Sit down with your person on a Zoom call. It costs you nothing. Just say, hey, how am I doing? Is there a hole here I'm not aware of? And if there is, how do we fill it? Because there's a lot of options. But, I think what the message here is, we talked about vaccine, we talked about insurance, and we want to start to bring this to a close so we can honor everybody's time. But I'll tell you, there's things coming down the pike. Everybody's been, oh, this is great. Goodbye 2020. Hello 2021. 2021 is going to have its own unique challenges that we've not been through. And so we have to stay diligent. We have to stay informed. We have to stay persistent in helping to not just grow our businesses and create new opportunities, but to protect what we already have built. So, David, I'd like to just turn it back to you for any final comments you'd like to sort of just leave our listeners with as we move to a close here.
Well, the first time we met and talked on a podcast, we spent a lot of time talking about COVID and the unknown. And today we talked about vaccines, which means we are moving through this a little bit. I really, really look forward to joining you on our next podcast when it's all behind us and we can start talking about some really, really positive things. But in all seriousness, I'm glad that we can touch on this today. I think this is a high-level conversation when it comes to liability. It is an area that some people, perhaps many people, have neglected. And so I'm encouraging people to pick up their phone and call their person that they trust and say, let's have this high level conversation, because I can't afford to let this happen to me. And of course, if they're having that conversation with me, I'm going to direct them to speak with somebody about, to somebody like Ike, whether it's asset protection or somebody like Ike, to put them in touch with somebody on employment law, because this is stuff that you can't turn your back on.
Right. So David, how can our listeners get in touch with you?
So will you have something on the podcast? Okay.
Yep.
So the best way to reach me is by my cell phone or by my email. Can I give those to you now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So my cell is 812-580-8555. My email is dmoore, D as in David, MOORE @shepherdins.com. So it's Shepherd is SHEPHERD, INS is short for insurance.com. And all they have to do is reach out and say, hey, I'd like to further this conversation. If I can see a copy of one's policy, at that point in time, I can lay it side by side against something we may suggest to them, and lay out some bullet points and make it, in a spreadsheet style that they can make an informed decision. Okay. But if it's not me, and they've got somebody that they trust, then by all means reach out to that person, but have that conversation. I think that's what's most important.
Thank you for sharing that. Ike, final comments from you, my friend?
Well, we've covered a lot of important issues with your help and with David's help today, and I think the message here, whether we're talking about insurance itself or asset protection or risk management in general, is that it is time sensitive. You cannot address these risks after you've incurred them.
Right.
So please, if, given the fact that the vaccine is here, given the fact that it's being rolled out, given the fact that we've been through group 1A and now we're in 1B and it's going to start reaching a level of mass distribution, now is past the time to think about these issues, get a policy in place, get your insurance in place, and make sure you're prepared for what is right around the corner.
And know the questions to ask your employees as you begin to wade into this water of what potentially could be discriminatory towards some people for the right and wrong reasons. So we want to make sure that we're aware of that. So with that, again, thank you David for being here, Ike for always being there. I know that we do a lot of work, a lot of research. We have our Business in the New Normal group on LinkedIn. We have our YouTube channel. It's Business in the New Normal, and add my name, Joseph Rosales, on the end of it, and you can pull up all of our past episodes. We've had some amazing guests over the last several months that are here really for one reason, and that's to help inform and educate our listeners about issues, about perspectives, about things that they can do to help not just survive, but thrive in this very challenging environment we find ourselves working through. So with that, I'm Joseph Rosales, and thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.